3 months after his assistant vanished without a single word of goodbye, Ethan Carter still kept her desk exactly the way she had left it. Her pen sat capped beside an untouched notepad. A coffee mug, long since rinsed by the cleaning staff, still occupied the same corner it had occupied for 3 years. Every unsent email draft, every small and orderly trace of her, convinced him that Sophia Bennett had not left because she despised him. Then, on a rain-soaked evening, he saw her stepping onto a commuter train with the face of someone running from the entire world. Her collar pulled high, and her eyes scanning the platform as though danger might be standing anywhere in the crowd. Ethan followed her, leaving his own car abandoned at the curb with its hazard lights blinking uselessly into the storm. What he found at the final stop was not a woman who had betrayed him. It was a truth that would break the heart of a man who had already lost everything once before. Ethan Carter was 38 years old, and by every outward measure, he had built a life that other men envied. He was the founder and chief executive of Meridian Systems, a technology company that had gone from a 2-room office to 400 employees in under 6 years. He drove a car he rarely had time to enjoy, lived in a house too large for one person, and had not taken a vacation since his divorce was finalized. Ethan was also, in the quiet architecture of his private life, a single father. His daughter spent most of her time with her mother in another state, and the arrangement was one Ethan had made peace with the way a person makes peace with a chronic ache, not by healing it, but by learning to carry it without flinching. Work had become the only place where Ethan felt fully in control. Everywhere else, control had already failed him once, and he did not intend to let it fail him again. Sophia Bennett had walked into that controlled world 3 years earlier as his executive assistant, and within a month, she had become indispensable in a way that unsettled even Ethan. She was 32, quietly brilliant, and possessed a kind of stillness that made chaos organize itself around her. She never arrived late. She never made an error large enough to matter. She remembered which board members preferred tea over coffee, which investors needed to be flattered, and which needed to be challenged. And she could read the tension in Ethan's shoulders before he had said a single, frustrated word. Colleagues joked that Sophia was the true engine of Meridian Systems, and more than one executive privately predicted that within a few years, she would be sitting in the chief operating officer's chair. Ethan did not disagree. He had, in fact, already begun drafting the promotion in his head, though he had told no one, not even Sophia herself. Then, on an unremarkable Monday morning, everything stopped. There was no meeting. There was no conversation. There was only a single email, sent at 6:14 a.m., before the building had even opened its doors. "I'm resigning. I'm sorry." 9 words. No explanation. No 2 weeks' notice. No forwarding information. Ethan read the message 4 times before he accepted that it was real. And even then, some part of him refused to believe it. He tried her phone. It rang once, and then disconnected. The number no longer in service. He asked the head of human resources, a steady, no-nonsense man named Nathan Hale, to look into it quietly, assuming there had been some kind of family emergency, some crisis that had forced her hand. Nathan came back 2 days later with a face that told Ethan everything before he opened his mouth. Sophia's apartment lease had been terminated. Her landlord said she had given only a week's notice and left the unit in pristine condition, as if she had planned the departure for a long time. Her old phone number belonged to someone else within 72 hours. She had closed her direct deposit account and requested her final paycheck be mailed to a post office box that, when Nathan tried to trace it, led nowhere useful. It was not the behavior of someone fleeing a bad job. It was the behavior of someone erasing themselves. For the first time since his divorce, Ethan Carter lost his composure in front of his staff. He canceled 2 board calls. He sat in his office with the door closed for the better part of an afternoon, staring at nothing. He was a man who prided himself on reading people accurately, on sensing dishonesty before it fully revealed itself, and yet he had spent 3 years working beside Sophia Bennett and had never once suspected she was capable of vanishing like smoke. Ethan's marriage had ended 4 years earlier. Quietly and without the drama outsiders often expected from men in his position. There had been no scandal, No headline-worthy betrayal, only the slow, exhausting realization that two people had built separate lives inside the same house and no longer knew how to close the distance between them. His ex-wife had moved 2 states away, taking their daughter with her, and Ethan had agreed to the arrangement because fighting it would have meant dragging a child through a battle neither of them wanted her to witness. He saw his daughter every other holiday and spoke to her most evenings by phone. Brief conversations about school and small daily victories that Ethan treasured more than he ever admitted aloud. The rest of his life, the part that used to belong to a marriage, had simply been folded into work, and work had never once let him down the way people eventually did. It was against that backdrop that Sophia had arrived, unassuming and steady, and had somehow, without either of them noticing exactly when it happened, become the one constant presence Ethan trusted without reservation. She had never asked him personal questions he did not want to answer. She had never used what she learned about his private grief as leverage or gossip. She simply showed up, every day, competent and calm, and over 3 years, that quiet reliability had become something Ethan depended on more than he ever consciously acknowledged, until the morning it disappeared. By the time 3 months had passed, Meridian Systems had hired a replacement assistant, a capable young woman named Emily Foster, who did her job well and asked no questions about the desk in the corner that no one was allowed to touch. Sophia's belongings had been quietly packed into a single cardboard box and placed in a storage closet, per company policy, in case she ever returned to collect them. She never did. Ethan told himself he had moved on. He told himself the ache in his chest whenever he passed her old desk was simply irritation at losing a good employee. He told himself a great many things during those 3 months, and none of them were true. It happened on a Thursday evening in late autumn, the kind of evening when the sky opens without warning and turns every street into a river of reflected headlights. Ethan had just left a tense board meeting, the kind that left a headache pressing behind his eyes, and he was driving home along a route he rarely took, delayed by construction on his usual road. The wipers on his car struggled to keep pace with the downpour, and the city outside blurred into smears of amber and white. It was through that blur that he saw her. She was standing beneath the awning of a train station, and even through the rain-streaked windshield, even after 3 months, Ethan recognized the particular way she held herself, shoulders slightly forward, arms crossed, as though bracing against something no umbrella could block. She was dressed differently than he remembered. Gone were the tailored blazers and the careful, understated elegance she had always worn to the office. In their place was a worn gray coat, several sizes too large, and a dark scarf pulled up over the lower half of her face. Her eyes moved constantly, scanning the platform, the street, the passing cars, with the wary alertness of someone who had trained herself never to feel safe in open spaces. Ethan's hands went still on the wheel. He watched her board the train just as the doors began to close, and something in him, something that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with 3 months of unanswered questions, made the decision before his mind had fully caught up. He pulled the car to the curb, left it badly parked with the hazard lights blinking uselessly in the storm, and ran. He caught the next train by seconds, stepping into a different car so she would not see him, and for the better part of 40 minutes, Ethan Carter, a man who commanded boardrooms and negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts without breaking a sweat, sat with his heart hammering against his ribs like a nervous teenager, watching the reflection of a woman he used to know in the dark train window. He wanted, more than anything, to walk down the aisle and ask her one single question. Why? But something about the way she sat, the way her hand occasionally pressed against her own forearm, as though checking that a bruise beneath her sleeve was still tender, the way she flinched slightly when the train jolted, told him this was not a conversation to force in a crowded car full of strangers. Several times during the ride, Ethan nearly abandoned the entire plan. He caught himself rehearsing what he would say if she turned and saw him. How he would explain sitting 3 rows behind her on a train that made no logical sense for a man who lived on the opposite side of the city. He thought about the board meeting he had just left, about the version of himself who spent his days making calm, calculated decisions worth millions of dollars, and how absurd it was that this same man was now hunched in a train seat, heart pounding, terrified of being noticed by his own former assistant. But every time the doubt rose high enough to make him consider leaving at the next stop, he looked again at the tense line of her shoulders, at the way her eyes kept darting toward the doors each time they opened, and the doubt lost its argument all over again. Sophia exited at the final stop, a station on the far edge of the city that Ethan had never had reason to visit. He followed at a careful distance as she walked nearly 2 miles through streets that grew progressively narrower and dimmer, past shuttered shops and buildings with peeling paint, until she reached a modest apartment complex that had clearly seen better decades. She climbed the exterior stairs to the second floor, unlocked a door with a key she wore on a cord around her neck, and disappeared inside without ever glancing back. Ethan stood at the bottom of the stairwell for a long time, rain running down the collar of his coat, staring up at the single-lit window on the second floor. The woman who used to run his entire professional life, who had once negotiated a contract renewal in 4 languages without breaking eye contact, was living in a building that looked as though it might not survive the next strong wind. It made no sense. Sophia had been paid well. She had savings. She had, as far as Ethan knew, no debts, no family obligations that would explain such a drastic change in circumstance. He walked back to the train station in the rain, and for the first time in 3 months, Ethan Carter felt something other than anger. He felt afraid for her. Ethan returned the following day, and the day after that, telling himself each time that it would be the last. He was not proud of what he was doing. He understood, on some rational level, that a man of his position, watching a former employee's apartment from across the street, bordered on something he would never have tolerated from anyone else in his life. But rational thought had stopped governing his behavior the moment he saw Sophia's frightened eyes beneath that station awning. What he observed over those days painted a portrait of a woman living with severe, deliberate restraint. Sophia left her apartment each morning at precisely the same time, and walked, never drove, to a modest office 2 neighborhoods over clearly, a job far beneath what her skills warranted. She returned home in the evening, sometimes stopping at a small grocery store to buy exactly what appeared to be a single day's worth of food. She never met anyone for a meal. She never accepted a phone call in public. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, nothing that might draw a second glance. It was as if she had constructed a life specifically designed to be invisible, and twice during that week, Ethan watched her walk instead toward the regional medical center downtown, entering through a side door reserved for outpatient services, staying for roughly 2 hours each time, before returning home looking pale and unsteady on her feet. A hospital, regularly, quietly, without anyone accompanying her. The fear that had been building in Ethan's chest sharpened into something closer to dread. He thought of every possibility his mind could construct: illness, addiction, an abusive relationship she was hiding from, debt collectors, something criminal she had gotten tangled in. None of the theories fit the Sophia he had known, and yet none of them could be ruled out, because the Sophia he had known apparently no longer existed. In her place was a stranger, wearing a familiar face, unable to sit with uncertainty any longer. Ethan hired a private investigator, a retired detective named James Whitfield, who came recommended by Meridian's legal counsel for his discretion. Ethan gave Whitfield everything he knew and asked him to find out what Sophia was hiding. The report that came back a week later only deepened the mystery. Sophia Bennett had no criminal record, not so much as a parking violation. She had no debts beyond a modest remainder on a student loan, which she paid consistently and on time. There was no boyfriend, no husband, no evidence of romantic involvement of any kind. She had not legally changed her name. Her bank statements, which Whitfield had obtained through channels Ethan chose not to ask about, showed no unusual withdrawals, no blackmail payments, no gambling losses. The only irregularity, the only thread that did not fit the otherwise unremarkable pattern of her life, was a series of recurring appointments at the same hospital, always in the same department. Whitfield, a heavy-set man in his 60s, with the patience of someone who had spent 30 years waiting for people to slip up and reveal themselves, warned Ethan early on that the investigation was unusual. Most cases like this, he explained over coffee in Ethan's office, There's a debt, a man, or a crime. This woman has none of the three. That either means she's better at hiding something than anyone I've dealt with in a long time, or she's not hiding a crime at all. She's hiding a sacrifice. Ethan had not understood what Whitfield meant at the time, and the investigator had refused to speculate further without more evidence, insisting he did not deal in guesses. He kept digging instead, quietly cross-referencing hospital parking records, insurance claim filings that Sophia's new, modest employer had inadvertently made public through an outdated benefits portal, and public health department bulletins about ongoing research studies at the regional medical center. Slowly, a pattern began to take a shape, though its full meaning would not become clear for another week. When Whitfield called the hospital directly to inquire, citing Sophia as a reference for an insurance matter, the woman on the other end of the line stopped him cold. "I'm sorry, sir. Information regarding that department is protected under a higher level of confidentiality. I can't confirm or deny anything about a patient there, and frankly, I shouldn't have confirmed this much." Whitfield relayed the conversation to Ethan with visible unease. "There's usually one reason a hospital gets that careful about a single department," he said. "And it's rarely a good one." Ethan did not sleep that night. It was Nathan Hale, the head of Human Resources, who reminded Ethan of the box. "We still have her things," Nathan said one afternoon, catching Ethan in the hallway outside his office. "Company policy is we hold personal effects for 6 months before donating them. It's been sitting in the storage closet since she left. Figured you'd want to know." Given he hesitated, clearly unsure how much he was allowed to acknowledge about his employer's unusual preoccupation with a former assistant. Given everything, Ethan had forgotten entirely about the box. He asked Nathan to bring it to his office that evening, after the rest of the staff had gone home, and he sat alone at his desk for a long while before he allowed himself to open it. Inside were the unremarkable remnants of a life lived carefully and without excess. A few spiral notebooks filled with Sophia's precise, slanted handwriting, meeting notes, to-do lists, a handful of doodles in the margins that made Ethan's chest tighten unexpectedly, a set of ordinary pens, a framed photograph of the office staff at a holiday gathering 2 years earlier, Sophia standing slightly apart from the group, smiling but somehow already looking like someone preparing to leave, a soft gray knitted scarf, the kind a person keeps in a desk drawer for unexpectedly cold days, which Ethan recognized immediately as one he had seen her wear a dozen times. At the very bottom of the box, beneath everything else, was a plain white envelope. It had no name written on it, no address, nothing to indicate who it was meant for or whether it had ever been intended to be sent at all. Ethan opened it with hands that were not entirely steady. Inside was a letter, handwritten in Sophia's familiar script, though the ink pressed harder into the paper than usual, as if the words had cost her something physical to write. "I'm sorry. I know this isn't fair to you, and I know you deserve an explanation. But I don't have the courage to give you one in person. Because if I look at your face while I say it, I won't be able to go through with what I need to do. Please believe that none of this is because of anything you did. It was never about you not being enough. If anything, it's the opposite. You were—" The letter stopped there, mid-sentence. The bottom half of the page had been torn away, cleanly, deliberately, as if Sophia had thought better of finishing the thought and had removed the evidence before she could change her mind again. Ethan sat with that torn page for a long time. For 3 months he had assumed, in the deepest and most defended part of himself, that Sophia had left because something about him had finally proven to be too much, too demanding, too broken by his own past to be worth staying for. It was the story he had told himself, because it was the story that required nothing further of him. No chase, no hope, no risk of being hurt a second time. But the letter told a different story. Sophia had not left because she stopped caring. She had left while still caring, deliberately, at what had clearly been enormous cost to herself. Something had made her choose to disappear rather than stay and be loved. And Ethan intended to find out what. He sat with the torn letter and the soft gray scarf laid out on his desk long after the office building had emptied around him. The cleaning staff moving quietly through the halls outside his closed door. He picked up the scarf and turned it over in his hands, remembering a particular winter afternoon when Sophia had draped it over the back of her chair and he had teased her, gently, about always being cold no matter the season. She had laughed and told him some people simply ran colder than others, and he had not thought about the remark again until this very moment, wondering now whether that persistent chill had been an early symptom of something neither of them yet understood. It struck him, with a discomfort he did not entirely enjoy sitting with, how many small details about a person could exist in plain sight for years, without ever being properly seen. He waited for her outside the modest office building where she now worked, standing beneath a bare tree as the last of the daylight faded from the sky. When Sophia stepped through the door and saw him standing there, her expression moved through three distinct emotions in the span of a single second: surprise, something that looked achingly like relief, and then, immediately following it, fear. Ethan. His name came out of her as barely more than breath. You shouldn't be here. I've been looking for you for 3 months, Sophia. I think I've earned the right to be somewhere. She glanced past him, up and down the darkening street. The same wary scan he had watched her perform a dozen times over the past week, though he had never let her catch him watching before now. Please, she said quietly. Just forget you saw me. Forget any of this happened. I can't do that. Ethan kept his voice level, though everything in him wanted to close the distance between them. Tell me why you left. That's all I'm asking. One real answer. Sophia's jaw tightened, the same expression he remembered from tense negotiations, the look she wore when she was holding something back by sheer force of will. It doesn't matter why. It matters to me. Did someone force you to leave? Is someone threatening you? The words came out of him faster than he intended, 3 months of unanswered fear finally finding an outlet. Is it money? Whatever it is, Sophia, I can fix it. I have resources you can't even imagine. Just tell me what's wrong. It's not about money. Then what? Is it? He hesitated, hating the question even as he asked it. Is it because of me? Did I do something? For a long moment, Sophia said nothing at all. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant hum of traffic and the rustle of the bare branches overhead. The more you know, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. The more it's going to hurt you. And I've already caused you enough pain. Please, Ethan. Let me go. Sophia, wait. Ethan took a step after her, his voice cutting through the evening air with an urgency he rarely allowed himself in public. Whatever this is, you don't have to carry it by yourself. You've never had to. That was never something you needed to decide on your own behalf, let alone on mine. She paused, back still turned to him, her shoulders rising and falling, with a breath that looked far more difficult than it should have been for such a simple motion. For one suspended moment, Ethan believed she might turn around, might finally let the walls come down right there on the sidewalk beneath the bare branches. Instead, she shook her head slowly, as if arguing with herself rather than with him, and continued walking, faster now, until the sound of her footsteps faded into the general noise of the street. She turned and began to walk away. Quickly. The way she had learned to move through the world over the last 3 months, quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention. Ethan stood rooted to the sidewalk, watching her disappear around the corner, and he made a decision that surprised even himself. He was not going to let her go. Not this time. Whatever she was protecting him from, he intended to find out, not to punish her, not to demand answers she had no obligation to give a former employer, but because some instinct deeper than logic told him that Sophia Bennett was not running from him. She was running towards something she had decided to face entirely alone. And Ethan could not shake the growing certainty that it was going to cost her far more than she had ever let anyone see. Ethan returned to his quiet surveillance with renewed purpose, though it no longer felt like suspicion driving him. It felt like fear for someone he could not bear to lose twice. 2 days after the confrontation outside her office, he followed Sophia once more toward the medical center downtown, and this time, rather than waiting outside, he found a reason to walk through the same side entrance behind her, keeping enough distance that she would not notice him among the shifting crowd of visitors and staff. He watched her check in at a reception desk, marked with a small, unassuming sign, Hematology and Oncology Outpatient Services. Ethan's stomach dropped. For one horrifying moment, every fear he had constructed over the past week collapsed into a single, devastating assumption. Sophia was sick. Sophia had left because she was dying and had not wanted him to watch it happen. He nearly walked straight up to the desk to demand answers before a nurse's voice, directed at Sophia with familiar warmth, stopped him cold. Sophia, right on schedule as always. How's the arm feeling since the last collection? A little sore, but manageable, Sophia answered, rolling up her sleeve to reveal a series of faint bruises along the inside of her forearm, the same bruises Ethan had noticed her pressing on the train weeks earlier. You're a hero, you know that, the nurse said, guiding her toward the back. Third round of donor cells this year. Not many people commit to a research protocol like that. Ethan stood frozen near the entrance, the pieces reorganizing themselves in his mind. Not a patient, a donor. He learned, through careful and quiet inquiry over the following days, questions asked gently of the same nurse, framed as a concerned family friend, that Sophia had been enrolled for over a year in an ongoing bone marrow and blood donation program, along with an experimental research protocol studying rare blood disorders. She gave blood regularly. She had undergone the far more grueling process of stem cell donation on more than one occasion. She had voluntarily submitted to months of testing and monitoring. All of it unpaid, all of it demanding on her body in ways that explained the exhaustion Ethan had seen etched into her face every time she left that building. But donor records, by law and by the hospital's own strict policy, never revealed who was receiving the donations. That information remained locked away, encrypted somewhere in a system Ethan had no legal right to access. He did not need the system to know, however, because, as he stood there, turning over dates in his memory, the timeline of when Sophia had first begun this quiet, private sacrifice, one date struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was almost exactly 3 years earlier. In the same month, Ethan Carter had collapsed at his own desk from what doctors had initially feared was a serious blood condition, before follow-up testing had, thankfully, cleared him of any lasting danger. The same month, Sophia Bennett had started as his assistant. He stood outside the hospital for nearly an hour afterward, replaying the nurse's words on a loop. Third round of donor cells this year. You're a hero, you know that. Ethan had spent 3 months constructing elaborate, frightening explanations for Sophia's disappearance, each one darker than the last, and not once had it occurred to him that the truth might be this: that somewhere behind her sudden resignation, her hollowed-out apartment, and her careful, guarded eyes, was an act of quiet generosity so enormous that she had chosen to disappear rather than let anyone thank her for it. He thought of every meeting they had sat through together over the past year, every late night preparing for an investor call, every ordinary Tuesday when she had shown up exhausted and simply told him she hadn't slept well, and he understood now that some of those mornings had followed nights spent in a hospital chair with a needle in her arm, giving pieces of herself away in complete silence. The realization arrived less like understanding and more like grief, sharp and disorienting. For a version of the last year he had lived through without ever seeing it clearly. Ethan went to her that same evening. And this time, he did not wait outside a building or trail behind her on a train. He knocked directly on her apartment door, and when Sophia opened it and saw the look on his face, she understood, without either of them saying a word, that there was nothing left to hide. She let him in. The apartment was small, sparsely furnished, but clean and carefully kept, the way everything Sophia touched always seemed to be. She sat across from him at a narrow kitchen table, and, for the first time in 3 months, told him the truth in full. 3 years ago, when you collapsed at your desk, she began, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea she never drank from. The doctors ran a full panel of tests. You never knew this, because I made sure you didn't have to know it, but for about 6 weeks, they genuinely believed you might have a rare and serious blood disorder, one that, left untreated, would eventually require a donor match for a bone marrow transplant. Ethan felt his throat tighten. He remembered the collapse. He remembered being told, weeks later, that it had been nothing more than severe exhaustion and dehydration compounded by stress. He had never known how close the initial fear had come to something far worse. "I registered as a potential donor the week you were hospitalized," Sophia continued. "I didn't tell you. I didn't tell anyone at the company. I just did it, because I couldn't stand the thought of you needing something that I might be able to give and not having tried." Her voice wavered, but did not break. "By the time your results came back clear, I had already gone through the preliminary matching process. And that's when they found something else. Not in you, in me." Ethan went very still. "An autoimmune blood disorder. Rare, but not immediately life-threatening if it's managed carefully. It requires ongoing monitoring, and because my case presented in an unusual way, doctors asked if I'd be willing to participate in a research protocol studying the condition, regular testing, regular donations to help researchers understand the disease better, in exchange for closely monitored care I might not otherwise have been able to afford." She finally looked up and met his eyes fully. "I said yes. Partly because it was genuinely important work, and partly because staying close to that hospital, staying inside a system that was tracking my health carefully, felt safer than facing it alone." "Why didn't you tell me?" Ethan's voice came out rougher than he intended. 3 years, Sophia. 3 years, you worked beside me every single day, and you never said a word. "Because I know you," she said simply. "I know exactly what you would have done. You would have moved mountains. You would have dropped everything at Meridian, hired every specialist in the country, turned your entire life upside down to manage my care the way you manage everything, completely, relentlessly, at whatever cost to yourself. And Ethan, I couldn't let you do that. Not after everything you'd already survived. You'd already lost so much of your life to circumstances outside your control. I wasn't going to become one more thing that broke you. So instead, you decided to break yourself, alone, without telling anyone. I decided I would manage it quietly, for as long as I could, and if it ever got worse, I would leave before you had the chance to find out and feel obligated to sacrifice everything for me." Her voice finally cracked on the last words. "That's what the letter was going to say. That's the part I tore off, because I couldn't finish it without falling apart completely. There's something else," Sophia added after a long pause, her voice steadier now that the hardest part had already been spoken aloud. "The condition isn't something that simply resolves. It's manageable, especially with the kind of care I've been receiving through the research program. But it requires vigilance for the rest of my life. Flare-ups, fatigue, the possibility of it worsening without warning. I watched what losing control of his own life did to my father when I was young. He was diagnosed with a different illness, one that eventually took nearly everything from our family, his savings, his marriage, his sense of who he was outside of being sick. I made a promise to myself a long time ago that I would never let an illness turn me into someone's burden the way I watched him become one, even though it was never his fault, and even though no one in our family ever should have made him feel that way." She wrapped both hands around the now cold mug of tea, as though it still offered some measure of comfort. "So when I found out, I told myself the only responsible thing to do was handle it alone, quietly, without letting it touch anyone else's life. I thought I was being strong. I think, now, I was actually being afraid. Afraid of becoming someone people loved out of obligation, instead of choice." Ethan absorbed this new layer of the story slowly, understanding for the first time not just what Sophia had done, but why she had believed, so completely, that disappearing was an act of love rather than abandonment. It did not erase the pain of the past 3 months, but it reframed it entirely, transforming what had felt like betrayal into something closer to a wound Sophia had inflicted on herself in an attempt to spare everyone else. The room fell silent, the only sound, the faint hum of the refrigerator and the rain, once again, beginning to tap gently against the window. Ethan sat with the weight of everything Sophia had just told him, feeling something inside his chest fracture and reassemble itself into a different shape entirely. For 3 months, he had told himself a story about betrayal, about a woman who had grown tired of him and left without the decency of an explanation. The truth was almost unbearable in the opposite direction. Sophia had not left because she stopped caring. She had left because she cared too much to let her own fragility become his burden. "You decided everything," Ethan finally said, his voice low and unsteady. "You decided what I could and couldn't handle. You decided I wasn't allowed to choose whether I wanted to be there for you. You made that choice for both of us, alone. And you let me spend 3 months believing I meant so little to you that you could vanish without a word." Tears finally slipped down Sophia's face, the composure she had guarded so fiercely finally giving way. "I only wanted you to be happy. I only wanted you to keep the life you'd worked so hard to rebuild, without watching it get consumed by taking care of me." Ethan reached across the narrow table and took her hand. The first time he had touched her in 3 months, the first time he had allowed himself to touch her with anything beyond professional distance in far longer than that. Her fingers were cold, and they trembled slightly beneath his. "Sophia, listen to me." He waited until she lifted her eyes to his. "I already lost someone I loved once, and I let it happen because I was too afraid to fight for what mattered. I spent years afterward believing that walling myself off was the only way to survive losing anyone again. But watching you disappear taught me something I should have already known. Protecting myself by staying distant isn't strength. It's just a different kind of losing, slower and quieter, but losing all the same." He tightened his grip on her hand. "So no. I'm not going to let you decide this alone anymore. Whatever comes next, good days, bad days, treatments, setbacks, whatever this illness throws at either of us, we face it together. Or we don't face it at all. That's not me trying to rescue you. That's me telling you I refuse to spend the rest of my life without you in it." Sophia let out a sound that was half sob, half disbelieving laugh, and Ethan pulled her gently from her chair into his arms, holding her the way he had wanted to hold her every single day for 3 unbearable months. "You're not leaving me again," he said quietly into her hair. "Not like this, not without a fight." For a long moment, neither of them said anything else at all. Outside, the rain kept falling, softer now, less like a storm, and more like something washing everything clean. The weeks that followed looked nothing like the frantic investigation that had defined the previous month. Ethan stopped tracking Sophia's movements, stopped hiring investigators, stopped standing in the shadows outside her apartment building. Instead, he simply began showing up, openly, invited. He drove her to her appointments and waited in hospital lobbies with a stack of business reports he rarely managed to actually read, too distracted watching the door for her to return. He learned the names of her doctors, asked careful and informed questions, and began quietly educating himself on her condition, not to take control of her treatment, but to understand it well enough to be genuinely useful rather than simply anxious. He cooked, badly at first, meals that Sophia gently teased him about while eating every bite. He learned which mornings left her too fatigued to function well, and adjusted their plans without making her feel like a burden for it. He never once, in all those weeks, suggested she should have told him sooner, never turned her honesty against her, never let resentment creep back into the space they were slowly rebuilding. For Sophia, the change was almost disorienting, after months of carrying everything alone. She had grown so accustomed to managing her illness in silence, to swallowing fear before anyone could see it, that having someone simply present, asking how she felt and actually waiting for the honest answer, took time to trust. "You don't have to keep checking if I'm about to break," she told him one evening, several weeks in, as they sat together on her small couch, a blood panel result sitting open on the coffee table between them. Better than the last one, though not yet fully stable. "I'm not checking if you're about to break," Ethan said. "I'm checking because I want to know you. All of you. Not just the parts that were easy to manage in an office." Sophia studied him for a long moment, something in her expression softening in a way Ethan had never seen from her before. Not in 3 years of working beside her. Not once. It was the look of someone finally allowing herself to be fully known. "I think," she said slowly, "I forgot what it felt like to not be fighting something alone. Then, let's make sure you don't forget again." There were setbacks along the way, moments that tested whether the trust they were rebuilding could actually hold weight. One evening in early spring, a routine blood panel came back with numbers worse than expected, and Sophia, out of old habit, tried to downplay it, telling Ethan it was nothing worth worrying about before he had even finished reading the report over her shoulder. The old Sophia would have managed the fear alone, tucked it away where no one could see it strain her composure. This time, Ethan simply sat beside her on the couch, took the paper gently from her hands, and said nothing at all for a long while, until she finally admitted, in a small and unguarded voice, that she was frightened. "Then let's be frightened together," he told her. And that single sentence seemed to do more to dismantle the walls she had spent years building than anything else he had said before it. Their relationship, once confined entirely to the boundaries of an office, slowly expanded into an ordinary life neither of them had realized they were building until it was already underway. Sunday mornings became reserved for slow breakfasts and crossword puzzles. Neither of them was particularly good at solving. Ethan learned Sophia's preference for tea over coffee, a small detail she had known about him for 3 years without ever once being asked in return. Sophia, for her part, learned that beneath the composed executive who negotiated deals without flinching was a man who still kept a photograph of his daughter in his wallet and called her every single night, without exception, even during the busiest weeks of the fiscal year. Over the following months, something that had always existed quietly between them, buried beneath professional boundaries, beneath Ethan's guarded heart, beneath Sophia's fierce instinct to protect him from her own struggles, finally had room to grow into what it had always been trying to become. It did not happen all at once, in a single dramatic declaration. It happened slowly, in shared meals and quiet evenings, in Ethan learning to sit with uncertainty rather than trying to solve it, in Sophia learning to let herself need someone without believing that need made her a burden. A year later, Sophia's condition had stabilized under consistent, well-managed care, her energy returning in ways that made the frightened, guarded woman on that rain-soaked train feel like a distant memory. Ethan had restructured much of his role at Meridian Systems, stepping back from the relentless pace that had once defined his entire identity, delegating more, traveling less, learning that a company could thrive without consuming every waking hour of its founder's life. Together, they had founded and now co-ran a small charitable fund through Meridian, dedicated to supporting patients navigating rare blood disorders, covering costs that insurance often failed to reach, funding further research into the very condition Sophia continued to manage, and connecting newly diagnosed patients with the kind of steady, informed support Sophia had once had to find entirely on her own. The old assistant's desk outside Ethan's office was no longer empty. Emily Foster had grown confidently into the role over the past year, and Ethan had finally, gladly, let it be filled by someone new. Sophia had not returned to that desk. She did not need to. She now held the title of executive director of the very foundation she had helped build. A role that fit her not as a fallback, but as the fullest expression of who she had always been, someone who quietly, fiercely, gave everything she had to protect the people she loved. Only now, she no longer had to do it in secret. The foundation had already funded its first 3 research grants and covered treatment costs for a dozen families who would otherwise have faced impossible choices between their health and their finances. Sophia often said that the work gave her illness a purpose it had never had when she was hiding it, that instead of being something she managed in secret and shame, it had become the reason she got to help other people walk through the same fear without walking through it alone, the way she once had. Ethan's daughter had grown fond of Sophia during her visits, the two of them baking increasingly ambitious desserts together in the kitchen, while Ethan pretended to supervise from the doorway, offering critiques neither of them ever took seriously. It was a small, ordinary kind of happiness, the sort Ethan had once assumed was permanently behind him, reserved for a life he had already lost the chance to have. He found, to his quiet astonishment, that it was not behind him at all. It had simply been waiting for him to stop guarding himself long enough to let it back in. On a mild evening in early autumn, almost exactly 1 year after that first fateful train ride, Ethan and Sophia returned to the same station where it had all unraveled and, eventually, come back together. They stood beneath the same awning, the evening air crisp rather than storming, the platform quiet around them, You'd still follow me, wouldn't you? Sophia asked, a small knowing smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. If I got on that train right now. Every single time, Ethan said, without a moment's hesitation. Though I'd prefer it if you just told me where we were going instead. She laughed, a full, unguarded sound Ethan had come to treasure more than any success he had ever built in a boardroom, and leaned her head against his shoulder as the last light of the day faded gently over the city skyline. The rain that had once marked the beginning of everything had long since cleared, leaving only the quiet, steady warmth of two people who had finally stopped running from each other. From fear, and from the simple truth that some people are worth staying for. This time, neither of them needed to disappear in order to protect the other. This time, love did not require a sacrifice made in silence. It only required the courage to stay, together, in the light.